Welcome to the 2025 Great Decisions Series, co-sponsored by Meade Public Library and the Sheboygan branch of the American Association of University Women. Great Decisions is a project of the Foreign Policy Association. They research 8 timely topics and publish a book with their information and also a CD. You can order a copy online from the Foreign Policy Association's site. AAUW is a nonpartisan organization dedicated to empowering girls and women. Locally, AAUW gives scholarships to non-traditional women students. We sponsor candidate forums for the nonpartisan elections in April. Another project of the branch is our annual STEM event for 6th to 9th grade girls to inspire them to consider careers in science, technology, engineering, and math. This year, our event is November 8th. Registration information is available on our branch website or Facebook. We are indebted to the work of Meade librarian Ryan Gonzalez and Aubrey Laux, sitting in the back, for their work in arranging the schedule of these programs and for their help with the AV setup. I also would like to thank Scott Maliff, Director of WSCS, and his cameramen for taping our Great Decisions programs for viewing on WSCS. Tonight's topic is U.S. Changing Leadership of the World Economy and will be presented by Pablo Toral, PhD, Beloit College. Pablo Toral is Professor of Environmental Studies and International Relations at Beloit College, where he currently chairs the programs in Environmental Studies and International Relations, as well as the Department of Political Science. He is affiliated with Beloit College's School of Environment and Sustainability. Dr. Toral teaches courses in international political economy, environmental politics, development, international governance, international relations of Latin America and Europe, and peace studies. He received his PhD in international relations from Florida International University in 2003. He also holds a BA in journalism and an MA in international studies. His main research interests include political economy of the environment, multinational enterprises, development, social theory, and pedagogy. His publications include Multinational Enterprises in Latin America, Latin America's Quest for Globalization, the Role of Spanish Firms, and the Reconquest of the New World, Multinational Enterprises and Spain's Direct Investment in Latin America. He is currently finishing up 2 book manuscripts on the international political economy of Latin America. You've done a lot. He'll speak for 45 minutes, after which we'll have a 15-minute question and answer period. We need to leave the room by 8. So when we get to the Q&A, if you raise your hand, we'll have Aubrey bring a microphone to you so that we can all hear what's being said. So now, please welcome Dr. Toral.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction. I see a few people at the back trying to get in. You should totally get in if you want to. Okay. So thank you very much for that very generous introduction. Have I done a lot or am I getting old? There's different ways of looking at it. So probably both. So I'm delighted to be back. I've delivered a number of presentations here as part of the Great Decision series in Sheboygan, and I'm very, very happy to be back. I actually come to Sheboygan, probably not as much as I would like to, but you've got a very beautiful town. I really like the lakefront, the beaches, and I bike, hike, eat out there. So very, very nice to be back. I wish the days were a little longer so I could go and walk by the water after this, but it's not going to be possible today. So what I have in mind today is to get through some of some of the key points that are raised in the essay, in case you've read it, in case you're interested in reading it. Then I'll do a little bit of fact-finding, to what extent the arguments in the essays are supported by empirical data. And then I'll take it in a different direction. I'll do a little bit of updating it. Has it aged well? What are the latest developments? And then maybe finish with a few key analytical points of my own. So that's the plan. So let's dive in. So this is, I suppose you've already said that, so I'm going to skip this one. So this is the structure. To do everything that I said I would do, I will start by talking a little bit about Daniel Drezner's arguments in the reading. And they'll talk about what he calls post-liberalism, 8 years of post-liberalism of the U.S. economy. So I want to spend a little bit of time defining that concept and talking about it. And then I'll talk about the concept of global economic governance, emphasis on governance, not government, and explain why it matters. Then I will talk about the 4 different potential future scenarios that he brings up. And finally, I'll conclude with some words of assessment of his argument, and then some of my own. So with that, let's start with the first point. Drezner's key arguments involve a historical economic analysis of where we are at today. From a certain perspective, his argument is that who runs the U.S. matters less. Whether it's Donald Trump, you might agree or disagree, matters less than the inertia of the U.S. economy and U.S. foreign policy, which Drezner argues has changed over the course of the last 80 years, but not so much in a way from the previous administration to the current administration. There is differences for sure that we'll talk about, but in essence, one of his arguments is that Trump is not that different from Biden from the perspective of foreign economic policy. And to make that claim, he argues that U.S. Foreign economic policy has been distinguished by 3 key periods. There is, again, differences across administrations, so I'm not going to argue that there aren't, but normally whoever runs the country is really bound by the international and the national context in which policy is made, and that really shapes the option. So policy is not always, a clean slate. You start from scratch to do what you want. There's lots of structural forces upon you. The first one is what Drezner calls embedded liberalism, which pretty much goes from the end of World War II until the 1970s, the Nixon years in particular. Then the second one is the age of neoliberalism, where the U.S. government decides that economic forces have to be unleashed, so that the government has to pull out of the economy and let the private sector take the lead. And then the fourth is post-liberalism, when there is more pressure on the government to get more involved. The idea is that if you leave the economy to the economic actors, they will mess it up by pursuing their own self-interest. They're not going to advance the global interest. Therefore, the government has to play a prominent role. So that is the argument that he makes. Okay, so a couple of things. He also brings up a few potential future scenarios. So I want to put those out there as well, because we're going to be moving into a very uncertain future, which is made more uncertain by some unpredictable comments by President Donald Trump. Although, again, Drezner argues, there's more continuity than change in spite of those comments. And what are the potential futures that we see? One of them is what he calls hypocritical post-neoliberalism, which basically means we're going to talk protectionism, but really we're not going to do that. We're going to let the market forces just do their job. That's scenario number one. Number two is failed post-neoliberalism. that the market is really not working well, the government intervenes, messes things up even further, so it's really not the dream scenario that we're talking about, or that we want to see. The third scenario is post-neoliberal paradigm shift, de-risking. Identify where the risks are coming from in the world economy and separate yourself, protect yourself from those risks. Whether it's China, whether it's Russia, identify the source of trouble and steer in the opposite direction. And the other one is absolute autonomy, decoupling, economic nationalism. We're going solo. The US is going to produce everything. We're going to minimize imports. We're going to try to produce as much as we want. We're going to go back to the 1920s. That's the first scenario. So based on Dresner's article, potentially all four are possible. Which one is more likely? He doesn't quite answer that question very well, but maybe I'll try to suggest a couple of things at the risk of probably getting it wrong. So we will see. So I'm going to walk you through some graphs right now. I can stop in each one of them if anybody is interested, but the main point is to see the trends. So if we are indeed going through the age of post-liberalism, and we've been in it since 2016, we've got about a decade of experience. So what's the record? Do we see changes in international American economy, the involvement of the US with the rest of the world economically, in terms of trade patterns, for example? A decade should be enough to see those patterns. So let's see that. So we're moving into assessment of 8 years of post-liberalism. So the US trade deficit has continued to increase, so no change there. But we do see a couple of interesting changes. We see more manufacturing happening in the US. We see more manufacturing jobs. That's important, but if you pay attention to the number, the growth in manufacturing jobs, we're talking 4%, so it's not that dramatic. So we do see more manufacturing happening here, less services, more manufacturing, farming, agriculture remains pretty much the same. So the change is somewhat important, but I wouldn't think is too important. Now this is a different trend. We see trade with China going down. We see trade with the European Union going down. So does that mean that the US just simply importing less? No. Canada is going up. Mexico is going up. So what we see is what we call a process of nearshoring, friendshoring. In the last decade, the US has decided that depending on markets that are very far away for manufacturing and production, involves risks. So we're bringing production either home, that explains the increase in manufacturing jobs in the US, or close enough. Canada, the US, and then we have an international trade agreement with both countries that allows the US to actually shape economic policy in those countries. That's what an international treaty does. It basically binds the parties to agreements, to certain rules that remain the same, and to reach out new agreements if some problems come up. So we see that in the last decade, the US has leaned on Canada and Mexico for trade and has started to move away from China and the European Union. However, trade with China and the EU is still gigantic. So the trend is down, but those are still major trade partners. Okay, so if we put things in perspective, what we see is that even though manufacturing is increasing in the US, is very high-tech, capital-intensive manufacturing is not the kind of jobs that will be available to people who don't have high-tech degrees, college degrees, which is not exactly what some people have in mind when we think about manufacturing. So there is more manufacturing in the US, but it tends to be done by corporations that own very sophisticated technological assets, know-how, etc., and those require them to hire people with many years of education, with high college degrees. So it's not that all kinds of manufacturing is coming back. The more repetitive, that requires less qualification of your labor, that happens probably still in China. What's happening closer to home is a kind of manufacturing that is more complex, that requires the use of more sophisticated technology. And what this suggests is that the US is very good at training their labor force with those skills, and that they want to keep those kinds of manufacturing activities close to the company where the development of the technology and the ideas are happening. This is normally what happens when an industry is innovating. When you're developing new products, you tend to produce them close to the company that is developing them. Once production becomes somewhat standardized, you start looking for cutting costs by moving them to countries where the cost of production is lower. So again, the sign here is that the US economy is very innovative, particularly when it comes to high-tech based manufacturing. So what do we mean by governance? There is no world government. I'm really not probably giving you breaking news here, but we need to work with other countries precisely because American firms still prefer to manufacture some things abroad, which means that you have to have a lever to pull when things don't necessarily go as you want. So countries create what we call governance structures. These are, imagine, for example, like a club. You want to participate in decision making, in enforcement, you have to be a member. So normally the United Nations is used as an example of that. The US-Mexico-Canada agreement is another example of that. And those normally are signed by countries, because countries are the ultimate sovereigns from the perspective of international law. But governments don't necessarily have all the skills and all the information, so they normally want labor unions, corporations, industry lobbies to be involved in crafting whatever agreements need to be developed. So we call that governance. The government facilitates, but the government is not the only player. And international economic governance is normally done that way. It is normally facilitated by an international organization, which is perceived to be more legitimate, more neutral. It doesn't advance the interests of a particular country, so it should be perceived as somewhat objective and fair. So countries, governments, corporations, non-profits, labor unions should be welcome and all somewhat equally empowered to participate in decision making. So this is really, really important for us to keep in mind. Normally, these kinds of agreements try to facilitate international cooperation, which means that they're going to try to avoid protectionist measures, because if you become a protectionist, then you rely less on other countries, then that goes counter to international multilateralism and cooperation. It intends to reduce uncertainty. When you have a business, you want long-term predictability because you're going to be making huge investments, and you don't want to make a huge investment that then somebody changes the rules and then those investments don't really pay off. So that's another key principle of international governance. Avoiding or reducing uncertainty and increasing predictability. If you can predict what the world is going to look like in 10 years, you're more likely to make long-term investment and trade decisions. So governments and businesses, markets, complement one another, technically work together with one another. They're not at odds with each other. They're not substitute for the other. And that's what international organizations take into consideration. Okay. Couple more things that matter in terms of governance, emphasis again on governance. The international community has realized that global markets are not self-sustaining, they're not necessarily self-running, they're not self-creating. A market does not happen. It has to be created. It has to be regulated. It has to be stabilized. Someone has to enforce the rules so that nobody takes advantage of those rules. It has to be a referee. And appointing a firm or an industry lobby to play that role is like asking the referee to play with one of the teams. It's not a good idea. With international trade, this is the same case. You have to create reliable, objective, legitimate laws that are enforced by independent international organizations. And that's critical. Ones that take into consideration the needs of each country, the key players, but one that also tries to facilitate the settlement of disputes or disagreements by playing by objective rules or rules that are the same for all. Exceptions are normally granted under some extenuating circumstances, but in general, the idea is that if you join the club, of international trade. You play by the rules. You get to shape the rules, but you don't get to violate the rules. If you don't like the rules, you negotiate a change of the rules so that everybody gets to weigh in. It's important to also keep in mind that countries that have big economies like the US tend to have big governments also. Running an economy requires a lot. It requires lots of resources. Economic resources, political resources, legal resources, technological resources. So what you see is the biggest economies of the world normally have governments that have the ability to tax a lot of money out of their people. A very sizable share of their GDP is taxed so that the government can actually enforce those rules and provide those services that are necessary to run the world economy. By doing this, you also expect that transaction costs will go down. If a government nationally or an international organization internationally enforces the rules, then players don't have to doubt one another. They don't have to be watching what the others do. They will trust that some independent party is doing that for them, which means that the costs of operating in this environment are lower. You don't have to police everyone. You can just focus on doing what you do. And normally, one of the sticking points is what is the limit to the role of the government? How do you create an economy that works as best as possible? Some people will say the government has to provide universal education, universal health care. We call that the welfare state, so that your workers are very well educated and they're very healthy, therefore more productive. Some people argue that the governments have to ensure that we have access to health and education, but that doesn't mean necessarily that the government has to provide it. The government has to make sure it happens, but it could be an insurance company that makes that possible through a system of privately owned educational institutions or hospitals. And these can actually be sticky points when it comes to international negotiations, because very often what you get is that some companies that operate in countries where the governments provide these services are accused of having undue advantage, because their staff don't have to pay for insurance. They don't have to pay for education. That's provided by the state. While in the US, we have to pay for all of that. So that puts us at a disadvantage. The counter argument to that, which normally comes from Europe, is, well, you've got choices. If you choose not to have your government provide that, you're definitely putting yourself at a disadvantage. Is that a subsidy? Is it not? This is what we call varieties of capitalism. Each society makes those decisions for themselves, but those sometimes become problematic in international negotiations. And this leads to resentment. It's what some economists call the discontents, and calls for protectionism. Well, if doing business in that country is cheaper, no wonder investment is going to go there. But just to stick with the same example, I have to pay for my health insurance. That's expensive. I have to pay for medical care. I have to pay for drugs. If you're in Europe, you don't have to pay for any of that. It's all free. It's provided by the government. That gives those workers a competitive advantage in terms of cost. It's a subsidy by the government. Some people argue this is unpatriotic. Why would you bring your production to those countries when you could do production at home? A corporation will say, well, it's cheaper. The government provides all of those things that I don't have to give my workers in this country. So again, very important aspect. And we call this the opportunity cost. Producing things and services close to the market where you are based and where you sell has advantages, but at the same time, there's opportunity cost. You're not benefiting from potentially, if you look at life expectancy and other health indicators, it's a healthier workforce in Europe. Or in China, which means that corporations have a lower health cost to their staff, fewer hours missed of work, somewhat more productivity that is associated with health because of better access to healthcare and better healthier habits that have to do with anything from not having to worry about being able to afford health care. You go quickly before you have a bigger problem. Or the design of the cities, which in many countries in Europe are designed to keep people active, which means that they're less likely to develop certain conditions because they have lower cholesterol, they have better health in general. So again, those are all hidden costs of doing business in different places. And that leads to relative costs, relative gains, which is something that corporations normally look at, but people don't necessarily. They want the jobs to be available here. They want the jobs to be now. So one of the periods of global economic policy that Dresner talked about is what he calls embedded liberalism. And this comes from a couple of very prominent scholars, one English, one American, who after World War II said, if we want to prevent another war, we have to tame the market. And Keynes in particular, Dexter White as well, they said the biggest reason for wars is unemployment. So markets do not necessarily lead to full employment. So when unemployment is very high, people will basically support any radical political idea, such as, for example, Nazism. We need to prevent that because there's a very clear correlation between politics and economics. They're interrelated. So the government has to play an active role keeping the economy in balance, keeping people employed. If unemployment is high, the government has to tax the haves and hire the have-nots, or create programs that would bring people back to work. They don't necessarily have to hire them into the government, but they can come up with a system that creates grants or subsidies for companies that hire people who are unemployed. There's all kinds of strategies that we can do. And this is what we call the post-World War II compromise. Businesses wanted a stable political climate, unions wanted social security, and governments wanted peace. And this is what we call embedded liberalism. Each country found different kinds of compromise along those lines. The compromise in part came as a result of the rise in economic nationalism. The economic crisis that followed 1929 led to an age of economic nationalism when the American legislators decided that if we remain open to the rest of the world, other countries will bring their exports to the US, people will buy foreign goods, there will be no jobs for the US. So there were a number of laws that were passed to set up limits to international trade, which was followed by reciprocity. Other countries did exactly the same. And the result of that is that countries were producing certain goods in amounts that were so gigantic that they couldn't consume, while there were other things that they were not producing because they had specialized in some goods and not others, but then they couldn't have access to those. And then other countries that had the goods in excess production, the goods that the American economy needed, they couldn't sell them in the US because the US was closed to international trade. So over the years, the crisis lasted a little longer than it should have had countries organized themselves, and World War II happened along the way. But there were a number of legal reforms that were introduced to basically make up for this. One of the reasons why the legislature tends to lean protectionism sometimes is that if you come from a district where some jobs can be threatened by international trade, you know that if you do not advocate for protectionism, you're not going to get elected. So it's what we call rational choice. So the local politician has an incentive to push for protectionism. If you are from a city such as San Francisco or New York that are very competitive at world standards, you want liberalism. You want open economies. But if you come from the Midwest and you're into farming, you want more protectionism because you want subsidies to keep producing certain things that in an open world economy might not be as competitive vis-a-vis farmers from other countries, such as Europe, for example, where they also get a subsidy because they're not competitive either. But the Midwest probably wouldn't be as competitive as, say, Brazil. And so that kind of politics explains why people, by doing the right thing, the aggregate of all of those decisions made at the local level led to protectionist policies that really choked the US economy and those of other countries. So reforms were introduced to allow the president to overrule the legislature when discussing international trade. And the president has sometimes exercised that. We can get into the specifics of how that works. Now what we have in place is what's called fast track, which means that the US president has the power to veto an international trade agreement. They don't have the power to necessarily footnote it or add things to this, which means that the legislature has to work very closely with the president to make sure that what comes to the president's desk is something the president is going to support. And that has really led to more openness in terms of trade. In general, we live in a very pro-market economy. The laws of trade in the US tend to favor competition because competition gets companies to always be on their toes, innovating, trying to be at the very latest, to come up with new products that are better, that make us all more productive, more cheaply. And competition also brings prices down. So that is the approach that informs American economic policy, which is very similar to Europe, which is the second one there. The one difference is that the US has normally, especially since World War II, preferred global trade and economic agreements as opposed to, for example, the European Union that is more for regionalism. The Europeans are more about having within the European Common Market and now the European Union about creating a regional European market where there is free trade. You get your degree from one country. You are allowed to go to a different country. Your degree is accepted. You can set up shop there, whatever you produce, as long as you register your company, you pay your taxes, you can sell whatever, you trade your products anywhere in the European Union. So for all practical purposes, the EU is a single market. The US has tended to reach agreements with a broader set of friends around the world for a number of reasons, including geopolitical reasons. It was very important after World War II for the US to not stick to the neighboring countries. It was very important for the US to have an important trade agreement with Japan, to bring Japan to the American orbit, with South Korea, with Taiwan, to basically help those countries build their economies after World War II so that they would not be puppets of China or the Soviet Union. So the geopolitical component informed a global economic policy where the US decided to open up its market and its resources to benefit other countries that would then be there to help the US to protect American capitalism from the rise of the Soviet Union, China, and other potentially threatening philosophies. And the way to do this was to create a multilateral, we call multilateral legal regime. The US decided to put everything on paper so that there would be a long-term commitment of those countries with the US economy. We call this American legalism. If it's in a treaty, we must abide by it. If we're not going to abide by it, we don't write it down, we don't sign it. But if we do, we abide by it. And that created a fairly stable economic system that lasted between World War II and pretty much now. And what are those principles? Those are the principles negotiated by the GATT, the Global Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was in place between World War II until the 1990s, and since then it has been mostly superseded by the World Trade Organization. This is one of the agencies under the United Nations. The UN, the United Nations, is normally given the job of facilitating global cooperation, and then it will create different agencies specialized in a particular, what we call issue area, in this case, trade. And the rules of international trade multilateralism, as first advanced by GATT and now by the WTO, is the concept of single undertaking. We can't just negotiate free trade one product at a time. We have to put lots of products in a basket and negotiate them all at the same time. Because if we go one by one, we will never get free trade. We will never have an agreement. And if we negotiate them in baskets, that means that all of you will have something there you want to support and something you will not. But that's exactly what politics is about. It's about compromise. We need to find the right compromise where you get most of what you can, of what you want, but you have to also give up something. And if everybody walks home really happy, that means that the agreement is poor, because that means that somebody's going to be very unhappy. You really want to make sure that everybody is somewhat lukewarm. A perfect world doesn't yet exist. There has to be consensus. In the end of the day, we all have to agree that the agreement we reached was not perfect, but it was the best possible agreement, and we're going to honor it. And we need to make sure that once we get into the weeds, once we get into the specifics, if there is disagreements or differences of interpretation, which are very possible, because people in different countries speak different languages, and they might misperceive a word in a language, there has to be an international settlement mechanism, an independent one. We all agree that if we agree to a certain rules, then there has to be a dispute settlement mechanism that is independent, and whenever somebody brings a case against us, we agree that whatever the ruling is, we'll go with. The WTO has its own settlement mechanism, its own court of arbitration. The US has been a particularly active country pushing for this approach, in part because the US economy came out of World War II being pretty much intact, as opposed to those of other countries that were destroyed, and the US needed to have markets for their products. The US was producing way more than the Americans could consume, so they needed a world to buy American stuff. And that's why creating a global trade regime was important. We're going to help countries of Europe build themselves up. We're going to help Japan. But then once your economies are back up, your infrastructure is rebuilt, you're going to trade with us. And we're all going to be wealthier as a result. We're going to give you loans. An international bank for reconstruction and development, which is the World Bank now run by the UN, was created under American leadership to grant loans to the countries of Europe and Asia destroyed after World War II, so they could borrow cheaply, rebuild their infrastructure, get the economies running, make a lot of money, and then pay back. That is the idea. Multilateralism, again, is the idea. Multilateralism means anything that involves more than two countries, as opposed to bilateralism or unilateralism. Unilateralism means going solo. If you go solo, nobody's going to go with you, which means you're not going to have access to any country. If you go bilaterally, you might be able to strike deals with a country, but there's 200 more in the world. So you've got a lot of homework to do. One of the key principles of trade is the principle of non-discrimination. It's a very liberal principle. You cannot discriminate against anyone on the basis of their identity. Just because something was made in Canada, you can't discriminate against it. The Canadians are just as fine as the Americans. Just because something was made in Mexico, you can't discriminate against it, because Mexicans are just fine people like the Americans. So this is the principle of non-discrimination, which is the economic correlate of the principle, or liberal principle of freedom and equality. We're all born free and equal, and that correlates in economics as, you want to sell in my country, please do. But when I come to your country, I expect reciprocity. And we need to make sure that there is an enforcement mechanism that is neutral in case someone tries to violate those rules. Couple more things. The WTO, just like most international law, is very nimble. Very few people run the world or are given the job of running the world trade disputes. It's a very small organization. It fits in a building. Normally, international law is based on self-compliance. Since there is no world police, the idea is if you're going to sign an agreement with another country, you don't want the other country to invade you to force you to comply. You expect the other country to honor their treaty, and you give them an incentive by honoring the treaty as well. So that allows us to have a very minimal infrastructure, legal infrastructure, which is very expensive. Normally, most of the disputes, the violations of international trade, tend to happen among the main economic actors. The EU, European Union, and the US, they have the record for suing each other, bringing each other to settlement of disputes. China tends to be more discreet. The Chinese don't like to go to court. They prefer to use muscle, but they do go to court if necessary. but normally China hasn't done very well in international courts. They've lost a number of disputes to the Philippines and other countries. So China is very likely to try to stand strong and then eventually compromise. The European Union and the US argue you're best friends, everybody has a disagreement, let's not spill any blood over this, let's go to court, our lawyers will take care of it, we'll go have a drink. And the other fourth party that brings lots of cases to litigation is Brazil. Brazil has an army of lawyers that specialize in international law. They are a gigantic economy. They are very competitive. They are very competitive in terms of agriculture, so they are the country that will bring American farmers to international litigation. Well, they can't do that because American farmers are not subjects of international law, but their government is. So Brazil will sue the US and the European Union because of their foreign subsidies all the time. And also Brazil has become the leader of the middle income and low income countries. Some of those countries don't have the legal infrastructure to sue the big ones. So Brazil has made it a point. You have a problem with the big guys, you tell me, I'll sue them. And that has given Brazil a lot of moral and legal standing in the world. They really specialize. It's another country you do not want to see in court. They are very good. And Brazilians are very likable. You know, imagine that they're suing you for billions of dollars and they're smiling. So, okay. So I'm going to go through these couple of slides a little more quickly. As I mentioned, after World War II, we, the world, tried to create the International Trade Organization, but the US eventually decided, nope, what other countries are putting on the table is not something I'm willing to sign. So we created GATT, the General Agreement, which was an agreement, and that actually ended up going into the 1990s, many, many decades, until we created the World Trade Organization. So it is important to mention that just like we talked about baskets, negotiations happen in rounds. So a country will host negotiations or the opening of the negotiations. Everybody will come with the issues they want to discuss for free trade, and they'll put them in this box, and that is the launch of one of the rounds of negotiations. And we only discuss free trade in those issues that have been added to the agenda until agreement is reached, which, as you can see from the data, it takes longer and longer. You can see the first one there in the 60s was led by the Kennedy administration. 4 years we have a deal. Look at the Tokyo round. We're talking now 6 years. If you look at the newer ones, we're really taking out more than a decade. What made things easy at a point was the emphasis on the importance of having global trade. In the context of the Cold War, this was very important for the US and their allies. They wanted to make sure that they could lean on each other in case the Soviet Union or eventually China became a problem. And one way to do that is to build what many scholars call economic interdependence. You're more likely to take care of other people if you have a stake in them. If the US is fed by Mexico in the winter, imagine what we could eat here in the winter if Mexico didn't send us food. So we have an interest in keeping Mexico on our side, because it's very expensive to grow things in greenhouses here in Wisconsin in the winter. Florida, California can only produce so much. If we really want to have the greens that we like to see in the supermarket, we like the supermarket to look like summer all the time, but we just don't have enough real estate to make it here. So it is in the US interest to keep Mexico on the American side so that Mexico doesn't flip and start selling that stuff to China. It is also in our interest to keep the Canadians on our side. Think about the importance of the Canadian oil and natural gas industry in an economy like the US that relies so heavily on natural gas, especially for us here. We get all of that gas coming from Canada. You can argue it's good or bad for the environment, but really it's what powers the factories of Wisconsin. So you really want to keep Canada on your side. You don't want Canada to start selling that stuff to China. And that means you have to make concessions as well. You need to be reliable for them. So what's in it for them? So the age of neoliberalism really exacerbated these leaning on each other and created what we call economic interdependence. We need Mexico to feed us in the winter. We need Canada to heat us in the winter and to keep us cool in the summer. We must have something for them. We have to have an economic agreement with them. That led to NAFTA, the North America Free Trade Agreement, which was renegotiated about 8 years ago as the new US-Mexico-Canada agreement. But this really accelerated since the 1970s, which led to the offshoring of jobs, particularly manufacturing industries. If Mexico is going to send us food in the winter, what does Mexico want? Mexico wants factories on the border. And that's part of the agreement. So let's bring some manufacturing jobs to Mexico. We negotiate what happens with the cars that are made there, the cars that then brought back into the US, a minimum tax to keep them cheap. But that guarantees that Mexico will be locked into the American economy. So we can trust we'll have food on the table in the winter, but then we need to let the Mexicans make the cars that we drive. I mean, I'm using an analogy. Mexico is more than cars, of course, and food. There's Cancun as well. Okay. I know many people go there in January. You know, wait for the food to come from Mexico if we can go to Mexico and then hang out in the beach. This leads to a process of deregulation. You know, the governments have to get out of the picture, let the American corporations and the Mexican corporations negotiate the best deal for each other, and, you know, what's good for them will be good for us. Mexico was pushed by the US government to privatize state-owned companies. We in the US, the government doesn't run companies. You, Mexico, shouldn't either. So privatize, back and forth. Those were the kinds of issues that were being negotiated. Why do we need to buy gasoline made by American companies that get no subsidy from the government, while you in Mexico get your gasoline from Pemex, which is state-owned, government-owned, which can subsidize gasoline in Mexico? So those are the kinds of things that were being negotiated. And Mexico has taken gigantic steps, particularly since the 1980s and the 1990s, to move in a direction very similar to the US. Mexico is incredibly similar to the US now as a result of these agreements where the US could shape Mexican policy. So we, you know, as I mentioned, the different rounds become longer, agreements are more complicated, and then with all of these globalization, with the offshoring of jobs to other countries, with the long delay in further trade agreements comes what American scholars call the discontents of globalization. I know globalization is working well for many. What's in it for me? I can't work at the factory where my dad used to work because the factory went out of business. So how am I benefiting from it? Globalization has actually had a gigantic impact on inflation. If you really look at the cost of living inflation between the 1970s, think about the 1970s when gasoline was so expensive, 1980s, has been going dramatically down, 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 down. And one of the reasons for that is the offshoring of manufacturing to cheaper countries, to Mexico, to Brazil, to China as well. So that's what's in it for us. We've benefited from better quality of life by having access to products that were very expensive before. At what expense? The people who were making those products lost their jobs. And those became the discontents of globalization. You know, I had to lose my job so that you all have your cheap plastic toys at Christmas. Okay. And one of the arguments that economist Joseph Stiglitz makes is if the discontents are not giving a backup plan, if they're not giving a social welfare system that will allow them to get some kind of welfare when they don't have a job or retraining, they're very likely to vote for the most radical of politicians that will basically call for a radical change of the rules. You know, their system is failing you because the corrupt elite, they just take care of themselves or their foreign friends. But I am your Messiah, you get me elected, I'll take care of you. They will be sorry. This is what Joseph Stiglitz said in the 1990s. If we don't fix it, it will break, and that Messiah will come, and then we'll deal with the consequences. So, what are the consequences? All right. Well, the future looks very, very uncertain right now because the ideas on the table, and we're going back to those future scenarios that were being considered by Dresner. One of them is what he calls hypocritical post-neoliberalism. We're going to talk protectionism, but we're going to keep neoliberalism. That's still possible. You know, the current government is talking about protectionism, but the tariffs come and go, the percentages go up and down. They seem to have settled, so some kind of protectionism seems to be here, but it's really not that draconian. Normally, the president threatens very high, very steep tariffs, but then eventually he backs out. And that's one of the things that international negotiators have realized. You know, if the American government threatens protectionism, just relax, wait a little, do nothing, and then when he loses patience, he will say, okay, you know, let's just do something else. So that's one of the cases. Another one is failed post-neoliberalism. So, and what exactly that means is not clear. What we're talking about, the case of post-neoliberalism was addressing the concerns raised by Joseph Stiglitz, and Barack Obama really decided to act on that, particularly after the financial crisis. He basically said the state, the government, has pulled out of the economy, and then we got the problems that we did. We need to bail out Detroit. We need to bail out the financial sector. We have to be very involved to make sure that those jobs don't disappear. And we have to find ways to get people to college, through college. We have to do on-the-job training for people who lose their jobs. Normally, when you lose your job because your company closes, economists say the economy will adjust and move in different direction. Yes, but one of the consequences is people of a certain age will simply retire early. And that comes with an emotional toll. People feel I'm too young to quit, but I just don't see what's coming. I don't see how I can start a new life somewhere else. So all of those things were taken into consideration through the 2000s into the teens to try to protect the discontents from the negative consequences of globalization. And that potentially could be all unraveled again or taken back. Another scenario is de-risking. Okay, so the idea is we seem to be doing quite all right with Canada and Mexico. Let's just keep bringing those manufacturing operations from China back to the US or to North America. If they're in Canada, Mexico, we do exercise some control. If we go back to the 1980s, we see that whenever we have a trade agreement with those two countries, we don't like it, they're willing to compromise. They're willing to make amendments, provided that we also create some other amendments of their own interest. So one of the latest amendments, for example, that was meant to appeal to American labor unions who are very concerned about jobs migrating to Mexico because labor is cheaper there. So many Mexican workers in the manufacturing industry of Mexico love Donald Trump because to renegotiate the agreement during his first term, he said that he would only allow for free trade of manufactured goods from the maquila industry if the wages of those workers increased significantly. And they were like, wow, he should be our president. And Mexico had to agree to that. So the unions basically sat down to negotiate with industry and with the government. And many of those industries were actually American corporations making cars in Mexico. So in the end of the day, it was the Americans paying higher taxes, higher wages to the Mexican workers. So it's very hard to tease out who is the winner, who is the loser. Okay, Mexican workers got a better deal, but then it means that the extra pay comes out of the pockets of American corporations. So, maybe that's an example of interdependence what we talked about. We all win, we all lose. And the fourth scenario is the one that potentially could bring us back to the 1930s, is decoupling, economic nationalism. We're just going to create Fortress America. We're going to make everything here. We know that's going to take a while, but that's the direction we're going. So what that means is that we're going to have to start making things here that we don't normally make. Where are we going to grow the greens that we like in the winter? Do we just raise LA because that's very good climate for growing tomatoes? If not, where exactly are we going to do that? That requires significant changes, which I believe are probably very unrealistic, but that potentially is one of the scenarios that we have on the table. You want independence, you want autonomy, you have to be willing to pay for it. It's going to cost you a lot, and you're going to lose some comforts in order to be independent. And that is the flip side to interdependence. If you're interdependent with other countries, you have to discuss everything with them, and they'll be there for you for what you need. If you want to go solo, you're going solo. And things that can be more cheaply purchased in Canada or the US or Mexico, now we have to make here at home. That's what's on the table. Okay, so I'm going to start wrapping it up. So the current administration has proposed tariffs to try to reshore, to bring back home many of those jobs. What those tariffs are in essence zero on Canada and Mexico with a few exceptions. So this is what we call rhetoric. There's really not a whole lot there. It sounds big, but it really isn't. So most of the goods and services included in the original agreement between Canada and Mexico have been honored. There is the tariff on the importation of Canadian energy, which means that will probably make our heating bill higher this year, particularly here in the Midwest, because a lot of the gas that we used to burn, I was going to say burn our homes, to heat our homes, hopefully we won't burn it. There was actually a fire 2 houses down from mine, and so that's fresh in my mind. So nobody got injured. The firefighters came quickly. But that's on the table. If we're going to pay a 10% tariff on the importation of Canadian energy, that means that our heating bill will be higher. So that's something for us to keep in mind. Imports from China, 10% increase in imports from China. Doesn't sound like a whole lot. Those plastic toys will be a little bit more expensive. 10%, think about whatever you pay, $20, 10%. It's not a whole lot more, but it's a little. For some people, it's a huge amount, particularly for the poor. Inflation is a tax on the poor. The wealthy people will always have the resources to spend a little bit more. The poor people will have to devote a higher percentage of their revenue, their income, to some basic goods. And when that is the case, you have to start making decisions. What is it that I don't buy in order to put food on the table, in order to pay my rent, in order to heat myself up in the winter? And that's why the poor are particularly sensitive to inflation, which is one of the reasons why Donald Trump was very successful by appealing to the poorer people. And he basically made the message stick: get me elected, I'll bring inflation down. And that really seemed to have worked very well. What is the potential impact of the proposed tariffs if they work? There is a 15% tariff with the European Union, which, by the way, seems to have been agreed to by the European Union, but if you read the fine print, it's for some specific goods and services, not across the board. So Donald Trump wants to tell his voters, I got the deal, 15% on the EU, and the EU will agree to that, so he can sell that. And then the EU President Ursula von der Leyen goes to Europe and said, it's just on a couple of things that very few people actually buy. We're okay. So, okay. And some of those things are French, expensive French wine and cheese, which the people who buy that in San Francisco can afford it. So it's not going to be too bad for us. But that, we're really talking about a significant cost to some people. $2,000 is a lot of money for some of the poorer people in our communities. Okay, so let me just wrap it up with a few conclusions, and then maybe we can have a conversation. So what's important for us is here that we're really talking about the politicization of international trade. Normally economic things don't become very politicized, but in this case they have been. So we see the case of capitalism itself being questioned, whether the US should be a global economic power or not. This is in the context of what we academics call varieties of capitalism. There is no one single form of capitalism. Mexico is a capitalist society, and yet they have universal health care. The US is a capitalist society, but they don't have universal health care. We have to have our private health insurance. And yet, they're both capitalist economies. So trade is incredibly important. because one of the reasons, the main reason why we live in our society, this is one thing that anthropologists like to tell us, is it's very hard to put up with people. But why do we do it? Because our chances of surviving are better as a group. The dinosaurs came to eat people if we were alone, but we learned that when we hang out together, somebody could take care of the kids, somebody could cook, somebody could keep us warm, and somebody could fight off the dinosaurs. So we learned that by living together, we could actually have a better chance of surviving. So politics and economics, in the end of the day, is about how we societies produce the goods and services that, at a very minimum, keep us alive. And then some quality of life. So that's what we're talking about. And what we've decided is that some of the things that keep us alive, such as, for example, greens in winter, come from Mexico. Does it have to be that way? No, it doesn't have to be that way. But if you want it to be cheap, maybe Mexico is the answer, maybe Chile. So those are the kinds of things to think about. If we're going to grow the food in the US, then who's going to grow it? So the expertise to grow greens is in Mexico, and that's why many farmers hire Mexican seasonal workers here in the US. So if you want to grow the food here, you have to bring the pros, and the pros are in Mexico, and there's a very strong anti-Mexican sentiment in this country. So you can't have it both ways. You want your greens, then you have to work with Mexico and the Mexican people. If you don't like your greens, then eat cheese all through winter until you can grow something else. So this really is what we're talking about. This is what's on the table right now. So what kinds of economy do we want to create so that we can procure the kinds of things that make us, again, keep us alive and then give us some quality of life? Danny Roderick is an economist who came up with this trilemma. He said there is no economy in the world that gets all of those three political goals at the same time. Societies have to compromise. Being a democracy, achieving national sovereignty, and being a major global economic country. If you want to be a global economic power, you have to give up part of your sovereignty. Because no country is going to allow you to run their economies if you do not allow them to run yours a little bit. Because you have to agree on the same rules, which means that you have to give up a little bit of your sovereignty, and then you can keep your democracy. But you have to give up part of your national sovereignty, and this is the challenge of globalism. If you want to keep your democracy and your national sovereignty, then you have to give up on the rest of the world. We need to start producing everything at home and think about the cost that that's going to have. Many things that we take for granted are going to go away. When the United Kingdom left the European Union a few years ago, very few people expected that the supermarkets would become empty. Because since the 1970s, the UK did not have a single agreement with any country to feed them. When they left the European Union, all of a sudden they left the EU, which has lots of agreements with countries to send them food when the EU couldn't produce it. The UK chose to go without food, and the shelves became empty. And that's when the British people said, what's going on? Well, you made a choice. You decided that through a democratic process to regain your national sovereignty, which means you gave up your food. There's a reason why we live together. So then the UK said, well, European Union, we didn't quite mean to really leave. Can you send us some food? And these tomatoes became a huge thing because what happened at the time is that Russia took advantage of this situation to buy lots of tomatoes from the Mediterranean countries. So there was a major tomato crisis in the UK. And this sounds laughable in a way, but political choices have consequences. And they do. Now the UK, one of the first decisions they had to make is who will feed the United Kingdom. And they came to the US, and Donald Trump had this classic line that said, "You're too insignificant for us," which really offended the British Prime Minister. But in a way, that was a lesson to be learned by the United Kingdom. You want to be independent, you have to pay a price. People will not want to work with you if you try to go solo. You're no longer reliable. You're on your own. So that's really what's on the table. Which one of those three? What two do we want? So you can only have two. A couple more talking points, and really I'm wrapping it up. The economy is also a very important matter of people's identity. What we eat, what we do, where we do it, where we eat it. It's not just about the act of eating. It's about how we cook it. It's the stories that we tell. So economics has been caught in these cultural wars about who you are, who you're not. If you're for international trade, then you must be a Democrat or a lefty. If you're for protectionism, then you must be a Republican, which is today what I hear, but that was not the case back in the day. So it's amazing how these issues become politicized in different ways. So states and governments and markets work very closely. They need one another. It's the principle of embedded liberalism. And when things become so complex, it's very hard to see the light, to see how one can help the other. Are we going to create another major economic crisis? Are we going to create another financial crisis? When the US had the financial crisis in the 2000s, Brazil and China came to bail out the US. The IMF did not have enough financial liquidity to bail out the American government and the banks, but Brazil and Mexico did. Mexico as well. Brazil, Canada, Mexico, China came together with a package of financial aid, and they loaned billions of dollars to the American government, so the American government could bail out the banking system, the manufacturing industry, the car industry in Detroit in particular. And then the American government eventually paid it back, just to borrow some more later, which explains part of the problem that we have right now. But those are very important relationships. Markets and governments need one another. What kind of variety of capitalism do we want to see in the future? And I conclude with a couple of paragraphs. Where are we at? How far have we come? So we tend to think of the US as the biggest trading power in the world. That is not the case. Call your attention to the fact that the first one is the European Union without the United Kingdom, which was one of the biggest economy. So if you add the United Kingdom there, before they left, the EU's share would have been larger. We see China closing in, and look at the UK there, 4%. So we'll be talking close to a fifth of world trade goes to or from the European Union. Let me just look at the trends here. If we look at the trends between 2000 and 2024, only in the 21st century, we see that China's share of the global economy has increased by 1,300%. Facilitated by the opening of the US economy and the European Union. The European Union has increased by 320%. The US has increased by 260%. It's not too far from the increase in the European Union, but I again call your attention to the fact that the EU lost the UK about 5 years ago. So if you add the UK there, the EU has increased significantly more. So what we see is the US becoming less and less important. And Donald Trump, I'll argue, is very aware of this. One of the reasons why he doesn't want international entanglements is because he knows that American power is limited. He doesn't want to be caught in major international disputes that we get the US in trouble. So less is more is the approach. So he's engaged in what we call a transactional approach. I can't fix all the world's problems, but I can fix yours with me, or yours. He's being selective. He's engaging in transactionalism, which is our departure from the American multilateral approach. The US engaged with all of the countries at the same time in general, and then there were some specifics to be discussed with individual countries. The US is now moving in the direction of bilateralism. I'll discuss my problems with you, and with you only, with you and with you only, which means that now US relations with other countries are very different. They vary from country to country. That, in the long run, leads to an erosion of credibility and trust. When your rules are too complicated, people don't exactly remember what you said about cheese or wine. Is that included in the tariffs? Is it not? Oh, I don't know. I'll look at that later. So that makes it very hard, which means that in the long run, other major trade partners are going to look less at the U.S. because they just don't know what they're getting or what they're getting into. So that also makes the U.S. a less qualified leader. If people don't want to work with you, you're probably not going to be making a difference. This is like when you learn that all of your neighbors and friends are still meeting for dinner and you don't get invited. That's exactly what's coming down the road. And then you think back, where did I make the mistake? And this is the mistake that might be happening. So the main trading blocs, the Brazils, the Chinas, the European Unions are more likely to try to negotiate the rules of international trade amongst themselves. And then most countries will just go with those rules just because those are the major markets, which means that the US, if you remove yourself from the rule-making process, you're gonna be less able to shape those rules. You can get a better deal if you sit at the table. If you leave the table, the deal might be struck by those who stay at the table, and then they will invite you to the coffee, perhaps. So the U.S. becomes less of a global rule entrepreneur and will be a rule taker rather than a rule maker. If we go in this direction, the U.S. will be less likely to be called upon when there is a need for innovation, the need to settle disputes around the world. And Donald Trump really knows this, and he is preparing for that. And one of the reasons why he's trying to de-link the U.S. economy from other countries stems from the fact that he believes, in relative terms, the U.S. economy is not doing as well as those of other countries. Although I think that's questionable, but that's the way he thinks. And therefore, he has to prepare to slow down the decline. The U.S. is no longer the great country that it was. Will he be able to make it great again? I think the U.S. is a great country. I think other countries are becoming great as well. To me, the way that I would approach this is that the success of the U.S. as a global leader is explained by the fact that so many countries want to play by the rules that the U.S. created in the first place. And they're puzzled by the fact that the U.S. no longer wants to play by their own rules. So with that, I'll bring it to a close, and I welcome your comments and your thoughts. Thank you very much.
Okay, we don't have time for a lot of questions, but are there a few?
And I'll bring the microphone over.
Here you go, sir. And I hold on to it while you talk into it.
Our major trading partners are Canada and Mexico, at least that's my understanding. And there is a trade agreement that is up for renewal in 2026. I guess my question for you is, how good has that trade agreement that we've had for the last, I don't know how many years with Mexico and Canada, how effective has that been for Americans, Canadians, and Mexicans?
Well, if we go back to the slides, it has certainly brought a lot of trade to that triangle, U.S., Canada, and Mexico. There it is. U.S.-Canada trade and U.S.-Mexico trade as well. So it has definitely been very good for American companies. It has increased. And the fact that it gets renewed regularly suggests that the governments of those three countries think that, in general, it's very good and it should continue. You know, when we get into distributional issues, whether everybody benefits equally or not, you know, as I mentioned earlier, that depends on whether your industry moves to Mexico or Canada or not. But overall, the fact that there is more trade and investment involving those three suggests that for the key economic actors, it's been a very successful agreement. And the reason why it has to be renegotiated from time to time is because conditions do change.
And how long has that agreement been in effect?
There's been a number of trade agreements in place going back decades. In essence, the elimination of tariffs to create some form of free trade is not totally free, goes back to the 1990s. And in part, it happened when Mexico could not pay back its debt in the 1980s, and the US government engineered something similar to what they did with Europe after World War II. They said, okay, don't pay now. I know conditions can be tough somehow, but I do want you to pay. I'm going to help you get your economy better. What can we do to do that? And what they did is that they negotiated a free trade agreement that would allow Mexico to export into the US to get those jobs happening in Mexico, to get the tax money, so the Mexican government could tax their people to pay back the debt to the American banks that had lent the money to Mexico, and then just continued. Very often, the big economic decisions are the result of a major crisis. Then we create the agreements based on that crisis, and then conditions settle somewhere, and then the treaty is not exactly ideal after the crisis has happened, has disappeared, and that leads to renegotiation here and there. But in essence, you know, it's the principle that informed NAFTA, which was that, remains in place. And Canada, when the US and Mexico were negotiating this, Canada said, I see the Canada in your hat, like, well, I don't want to be left out of this, so I want to be a part of this, which means that Canada was a rule taker, because Canada was invited in late when a lot of the language of the treaty was already negotiated between Mexico and the US. There's a very famous phrase by the Minister of Finance of Mexico who came to talk to Ronald Reagan and Silva Herzog. And Ronald Reagan said, tell him I will not see him. He owes me billions. He needs to pay billions. And apparently the Mexican Minister of Finance wrote in a paper napkin, if I owe you $10, I would have a problem. But I owe you $100 billion, you have a problem. And if you don't help me, you're not going to get it. And that's what triggered the negotiations. Apparently, what came out of Reagan's mouth cannot be said here, but eventually that really got the two to sit down and talk.
We spend a lot of money on our armed services. What role does the armed services play? And then another question is, what about climate change? How is that affecting?
Yeah, so the armed services, this is one of those perennial questions that we study, government-society relations. It's what we call guns versus butter. You know, you need the guns, meaning security. Without security, you can't produce anything. But when do you go overboard so that you're overspending in security, taking away resources that could be used for other things? And, you know, is Mexico, is Canada the major threat to the US? Probably not. So I think when we talked about the armed forces, the point of the armed forces is not to prevent an invasion from Mexico or from Canada. So that is the type of, what was the second question, sorry? Oh yeah, climate change. So one of the deals that was negotiated into NAFTA is climate change. And one of the arguments in the 1990s, eventually in the 2000s, and by Donald Trump during his first period, was that we want Mexico to increase their environmental standards. We don't want jobs to migrate to Mexico just because they can pollute there, but they cannot pollute here. So that's the second area in which the North American trade agreements have really, really, really affected or shaped Mexican law, particularly labor rights, pay in the manufacturing industry in Mexico, and environmental standards. So since the 1990s, Mexico has really cleaned up their air pollution. So that is not to say that there is no pollution involved, but you know, Donald Trump will probably not frame this in terms of climate change, but he will say we don't want companies to move to Mexico just because pollution is allowed there. And you know, with that comes all kinds of environmental legislation. So this has been a very important aspect. It's what we call the blue-green coalition, labor and environmentalists pushing the U.S. government to push Mexico to increase their labor laws, their standards, and the environmental standards. And that has been very successful. The same is true to Canada. Canada's environmental legislation lags behind the US, and the US normally uses international trade agreements as leverage to get other countries to bring theirs up, so that environmental concerns are not one of the decisions that make American companies move abroad.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much.